Hello guys, today we're going to see how the Latent Arrow skill gem scales this damage. The motivation comes from the following scenario. Have you ever felt stuck with your progression in yellow maps not being able to go through red maps? Well, that's something that happens fairly common depending on the build that we're playing. In my experience, it's usually because you either don't have enough damage or defenses, or even both of them. But most of the times it is because you cannot slay the mobs fast enough, meaning that you need to have more damage. And this is what I want to talk about this video, about how do you scale the damage for the Later Arrow skill gem. So this is why it is important to understand how to scale the damage for the Later Arrow skill gem. First, we're going to talk about how the damage scaling formula works, and finally we are going to see how this is applied to our Latent Arrow example that I have from a build from the past league. Okay, now let's see how damage is calculated in Path of Exile. This is only for attack skills, so you're going to see the spells have a different way. It's similar, but it's not literally the same. So first, we are going to start with the weapon damage. That's the base of the base damage. The weapon damage comes from the bow, in this case for the Latent Arrow. So this is the, let's say, so this is the base damage for the weapon. Then we have that there are other sources that increase the base damage. So they are summed together to these numbers. So for example, in this case of the bows, we have the 3 elemental rolls that you might already know, but this is very important for scaling your damage. So this is summed up together with all of these sources for your base damage. There's also the hard irons that gives you more base damage. You can also find more of these modifiers, for example, in the rings. So this is the, let's write it here, this is the base damage. Okay. Then the next step is the increased damage. For example, we have here the ring in this example that it has some increased damage, increased elemental damage with attack skills. So what this does basically is to multiply the base damage. So this is going to multiply all of the number that we sum together here, and that's going to be in this step. If you have different sources of increased damage in your build, all of those different sources are getting summed up together. So for example, if you have from the other ring 40% increased elemental damage, then the total number you will find here, it will be 81. Okay, if you sum together these mods, and we will have 81%, and this is the number that is going to be multiplied by your base damage. Okay, the next step are the more modifiers. I have an example here from the Awakening Elemental Damage with attack supports, and as you can see, we have a line, we have a mod here that increases, that has more damage for our elemental damage. Okay, so this is the next step, which is also multiplied by everything that's up to this point. And the main difference between the more modifiers and the increased modifiers is that the more modifiers from different sources are multiplied by each other. Okay, so for example, if I have another 40% elsewhere, the number that we have here, the previous number, let's say x, is going to be multiplied by 1.4, and since we have another source, this has to be a different source for the more. So if you have a different source for the more multiplier, it is going to be multiplied again for 1.4. So this number is actually affecting the other modifier and the previous number. That's the main difference between a more modifier and increased modifiers. And also this is why having multiple different sources for the more modifiers is so strong compared to increased modifiers. And that's the same reason why getting more modifiers is harder than getting increased modifiers. And finally, for the hit damage calculation, that this is what we are doing here, we have the mods that amplify your damage, either by amplifying your output damage or also making your enemy to take increased damage. So for example, we have the Trinity support gem that in my opinion, this is one of the most strongest skill gems, skill support gems in the game. And there's a line here that says that when some condition happens, the support skills are going to penetrate 60% of the elemental resistances. So what this means is that all of the previous number that we have up to this point, it is going to be multiplied by 16%. This is going to affect the more modifiers, the base damage, and the increased modifiers. Here I also have an example from making your enemies to take more damage. You can see in this node from the tree, it says that the market enemies takes 10% increased damage. So this is basically 1.111. And what we get at this point, once we calculate all of these steps, is your hit damage. Okay, the final result here is your hit damage. What does this mean? Well, if you shoot any skill from with projectiles, for example, and it is being an attack skill, if that projectile hits the enemy is going to take this amount of damage. Okay, this number, let's say, I don't know, 100 damage. Okay, the enemy has 100 life, you're going to slay the enemy. This is the damage that we're dealing with each one of your projectiles to the enemies. Okay, but this does not end here, because this is just the damage we deal with one projectile when we hit an enemy. Like we said, there are two extra factors that we need to consider here that you already know them, and this is the critical chance. Okay, well, it's right, critical, and also the attack speed. Okay, because we don't want to have the hit damage only. What we want to calculate is the DPS that we deal to enemies, because that's the number that we see in the bar in the left side for the POE, and that's what we use to compare the damage between builds. So with the hit damage, the next step is to calculate and normalizing with the critical damage. So let's say we have the hit damage. Okay, let's say HD hit damage, and then we are going to multiply that number for the chance of not critting. So if you have 70% critical chance, that's going to be 30% of the time you're not going to crit. So this is the same as 100% minus your critical chance. Okay, let's try CC. And then we are multiplying the same number by your critical chance, that is CC, multiplied by your critical multiplier. Okay, so if you have 100% extra critical multi, you're going to deal the times that you're going to crit, you're going to deal double that damage. And finally, this is how much damage we can deal each time we hit with a projectile to an enemy. The final step is to get into account the attack rate. This is affected by the attack speed modifiers. So if you deal, let's say, the final hit damage, considering the crit chance, let's say if you have an attack rate of 2 attacks per second, that's going to mean that in the period of 1 second, we're going to hit the enemy twice. So we are going to multiply by 2 in this case. So this is the same as multiplying for the attack rate. You can find the attack rate number. This is the times you can attack per second, and you can find this number in POE, and we're going to see in the next section. So the final number that you get here, if you reach 1 million damage here, this is the POE number. So this is your final DPS, and all of these steps, this is how the damage is calculated for attacks in Path of Exile. Okay, so let's see what we already saw applied. So in real life example, I have here a Legendary Arrow build that I filtered by not being too crazy. So as you can see, they don't have Headhunter and they're not using Mage Blood. I also filtered by not having the Omniscience Amulet, because all of those items we aren't going to get them unless we are ultra lucky before we reach the point between these yellow maps and red maps. This is a good example. This is not day one, of course, but this is a good example to know where we want to go. So here in the left in POE, we can see the actual hit DPS. This is the number that we want to calculate, and this is the number that we want to analyze. In POE, we have a tab for the calculations. As you can see here, where you can select any of these skills you are dealing to see its specifics. In the skill hit damage box, that is this right here, you have all of the information for the damage calculation that we already saw in the last section. So for example, we have the added damage here at first. This is the damage that gets added to your base weapon damage. So for example, as you can see, the damage comes from the higher airs. This is the chest that has some added cold damage for the bows attacks, and that's why it is getting added here. Then we have the fire. This is coming from the anger aura, and some coming from the quiver, and this is added to your base damage. Then we have the increase modifiers. So you have the increase modifiers for a specific type, for example here for the elemental damage, and then you have the increased damage for all types of damage. So for example, here is all the list of the increased damage for this build. And one thing that you have to note here is that most of it comes from the tree itself. So this is something that we won't need to pay attention to scale damage, because we are basically copy pasting all builds. So we just have to level up our character, and sooner or later we are going to have all of these, with the exception of here there is 40% increased damage that comes from the quiver. This is something that we can start taking notes. In this build, the quiver has 40% increased damage with bows, and also in the same gear piece in the quiver there is the increased 30% of projectile speed. And since this build is using the mastery for the increases and reductions for the projectile speeds also are applied to the damage with bows, this is why it also gets summed up together here with an extra 30% of increased damage. Then we can check the specific elemental increased damage. This is, let's say half of it comes from a tree, so we're going to ignore that. And the other half comes from our items. So 2 of them are actually from the gems. This is again something that we won't need to care, because these gems are going to be level up passively, and the setup for the 6th is going to be the same. Everyone is going to be using Trinity in the Enlightener rebuilds, and everyone is going to be using their weakened elemental damage with attacks once we get a 6th. And this is where it starts getting interesting. As you can see, there are 3 modifiers here for increased damage that's over 120, and they come from the rings. As you can see, this build has an increased elemental damage with attacks. This is the fracture mod that you can see in the screen, and this build is using one of those in each one of the rings. So this is another thing that we need to take note, that the rings can roll this mob, and I would bet that this is a high tier mob. And also the other item is the belt. Okay, the belt has this mod that it was previously called wet, but now it's more general, so it's only called increased elemental damage or attack skill. And this is another mod that can be rolled specifically in your belt, and this is something that if we don't have, or we ignore, or worse, we don't know, we will be missing a lot of damage from our build, and all of these small pieces add up together to get the final number that we see in the screen. Okay, moving on for the more modifiers, starting for the all types modifiers, we have that first we have some of more multiplier damage from fire shot. This is our ascendancy, so again we don't have to take to pay attention on that, we are getting it sooner or later. And then the other modifier comes from the frenzies. This is 20 and frenzies gives 4, so this build has 5 frenzies, 3 natural, and we had 2 extra frenzies from the tree here and here. So again, I wouldn't pay much attention to this because we are getting them once we level up. And then for the more modifiers for the elemental damage, we have that all of them comes from the skill gems. Not much else to say. We are getting them from the 6-ring setup. Then the next step is the amplifier mods that we already talked about. And these are specifically for each type of the elemental damage that we deal. So let's take, for example, the cold damage. As you can see, we have from one side the output damage, the modifiers that modifies all damage that we deal, and in the other hand we have the amplifiers that makes your enemy to take more damage. So as you can see here, first we have 16% of more damage from the Trinity because this is elemental penetration. Then we have in the boots, this has at the top there is an enchant that, by the way, this is getting removed, so let's ignore it. Then there is this G-Wheel and this G-Wheel that has 1% elemental penetration. This is a very minor thing. And finally, there is the Force of Nature. This is a node in the tree right here that makes your attack damage to penetrate the elemental resistances. And that's the number we see here, the 10%. And in the other hand, we have what makes your enemies to take more damage. From one side, the Mark of the Prey. This is again a node here that makes your marked enemies to take more damage. And here in the last row we have some numbers, and this is the hit DPS. As you might remember, let's show you again the paint. The hit DPS that we have here, the hit damage, is actually the damage that we are seeing here in this row. Okay, this means that each time we hit an enemy, we are dealing from 31,000 to 51,000 fire damage. The same for cold, the same for lightning, and this is the sum of all of these rows. So we are actually dealing, from summing up all of the types, from 63,000 to 168,000 damage. Okay, the next step, once we have the hit damage, is to calculate the hit damage normalized by the critical chance. As you can see in the box, you can see that there is the hit damage. This is the average damage from 168 to 63k, and then this is multiplied by your chance of not critting. Since this build has 99% crit, this is less than 1%, and then it sums together the base damage multiplied by the crit multi. This is 5 times more damage, and then it's multiplied by the crit chance. This is 99%. So this is the actual final number that you deal with each one of your projectiles, and this is what it is called here as the average damage. This is the hit damage with the critical normalization. And finally, for the DPS, we have to take into consideration the attack rate. As you can see here in the left, we have that this build attacks 4 times that 13 times per second. So what we do is basically multiplying the average damage by the attack rate, and this is the final DPS number that we see in POE always in every build here as the hit DPS. This is the actual number that we use to compare between builds in Path of Exile. But there is some caveats here that we didn't explain yet, and that's for example, the attack speed. As you can see, the attack speed is 4.13, but where does this attack rate comes from? Well, we have the attack in cast rate box here, this one, and as you can see, we have the attack speed increase. This is increased damage, this is more damage, and this is the final attacks per second. So for the more attack speed, there is none. And for the increased attack speed, we can take a look that most of it comes from a tree. And this is mostly from a tree, as you can see, but we have 2 items that are giving us attack speed. And this is another thing to take note. And both of the attack speed modifiers we have here are from some rare jewels, okay? One of them is giving 5% attack speed and the other 8% attack speed with bows. So that's affecting our final attack speed, and obviously the frenzy charges that gives us more attack damage and more attack speed. This final increased attack speed number is actually multiplied by your base attack speed, Where does the base attack speed? Well, since we are attack skill, the base attack comes from your weapon. As you can see at the top of the bow, it says attacks per second 1.71. This is the base bow attack speed multiplied by the attack speed modifiers that we have in the bow. That's your base attacks per second. So that's what it gets multiplied by the attack speed multipliers that we just saw here. As you can see in the calculation, there is a line that says that this also being affected by the action speed modifier. This is coming from first the tailwind effect that we get from our ascendancy, and then from one of the implicits in the boots. As you can see, one of the Eldritch implicits that increase our action speed. So the action speed increase everything, the movement speed, the attack speed, the cast speed, etc. So that's why it's getting factored here for a final around four times cast. In this case is attacks per second. And then we have to finally, this is the last thing, we need to talk about the critical multiplier, because we saw that this is a 500 critical multiplier, but we didn't see where does this 500 comes from. Okay, so for the critical multiplier sources, as you can see, already half of them comes from a tree. So this is another thing that we need to take into consideration, that we need those levels. So if you are, for example, level 80, getting to level 90 will make a lot of difference, okay? Then the other half comes from the items. This is the, let's say, the hard part that we need to pay attention to replicate. So first there is a red jewel that has the double mod for the multipliers. This is one is giving 12 and the other is giving 15. Then here in this build they're using a watcher side. This is a pretty good watcher side. This is, let's say, I don't know, 20 30 divines in the early on in the league. But what it says, the watcher size gives you 45 critical strike multiplier when you're affected by anger, and surprise surprise, we are using anger here in this build. So this is why this is giving us 45 extra critical multiplier. Then in each one of the rings, they can roll up to 20 global critical multiplier. So this is why there is an extra 18 and an extra 20. And as you can see, all the items start summing up together, and that's how you get these high numbers in the build. You have small parts in every part of your gear, and they end up counting up to a higher number. Your number comes from your amulet. As you can see, 58. I would guess that this is up to 60 critical multiplier. This is an easy source because this is a fairly common item even in Lixard. And finally, we have that the quiver has some critical multipliers, 38%, that is adding more multipliers for crits. Then for the critical sources, as you can see, this build is almost capped on the critical chance. And again, most of the critical chance comes from the tree. As you can see here, most of it comes from the tree itself. Then some is coming from the diamond flask. This is obviously active, and this is the flask, and also the modifier in the same flask that increase critical chance. So this is something that a lot of players ignore, and it is to well roll your flasks. Then some of it, well, a big chunk is coming from your precision aura, and then there is some crit chance in the quiver. As you can see, this quiver is pretty damn good. It has some base damage, critical, multiplier, life, resistance, and increased damage. This quiver is insane, actually, especially for a Elixir scenario. And all these multipliers are actually multiplying your base critical damage. The same as increased modifiers for damage, this is also applying in the same manner to your critical, and your critical base chance is again coming from your weapon. Okay, as you can see, the bow has a base critical chance, and that can be improved by having a increased critical chance in the bow itself. So that's affecting the base, and that 8.13% that you see here is the number that is being multiplied by all of these increased critical chance. And finally, I want to mention the accuracy, okay? This is something that you always want to have at 100% because the hit chance is like an amplifier modifier but negative, meaning that if you have, for example, it doesn't matter the damage you have, if you have 10 million damage, if your hit chance is 50%, your damage is getting halved by 2, okay? Because half of the times you're going to deal your damage and your half you're going to deal 0 damage. So always pay attention that your hit chance needs to be always 100%. It is not enough with 90%. You need to have, this is the baseline to have 100%. And most of the accuracy actually comes from the tree. And there is also the precision aura that helps you a little bit, and the dexterity providing you some of these innate accuracy. So yeah, there are some mods here in the tree that gives you accuracy, and there's also a mastery that gives you 500 accuracy that provides you a big chunk of it if you need it. So in summary, what did we learn? Well, first, that the levels are very important, okay? We saw that most of our multipliers in all of these steps for the damage calculation comes from the tree itself. So if you're level 80, your character is definitely not at its peak. So try to get at least to level 90, 91, 92, 93, 95 to get all of these benefits that the tree offers. Then to improve our base damage, you are going to aim for a good flat rolls in your bow. And also there are other sources to increase our base damage. For example, we saw that you can get in your chest. There's also a roll that you can get in your quiver, and there's also from your rings. Then for increased damage, that you can get good rolls in your jewelry, specifically both of your rings and your belt. You can have some increased attack damage to improve your overall damage. Then for a critical chance, it's crucial to have a bow with a good base critical chance, so that gets amplified by all of other critical chance modifiers. And also you can have a diamond flask to increase even further, and some of your flasks has to have the increased critical chance mod by rolling your flasks. And finally, the quiver that can roll and attack an increased critical chance modifier. And then aside from the critical chance, we have the critical multiplier that you can get it from different sources. For example, from rare jewels, you can get more than one critical multiplier modifiers. And then again, your rings can have some extra critical global multiplier that will help by making your criticals even stronger. And finally, for the attack speed, as we saw, you can get some from rare jewels, and also you can have the amplified by the action speed that you get from the tailwind and from the implicits in your boots. And also it gets amplified too by the frenzy charges. That's basically coming from a tree, but the frenzy charges are going to increase your attack damage and at the same time the attack speed. So in the end, having all of these aspects at least in mind and knowing what can be your next steps and what can you get some of the modifiers will help you greatly to avoid getting stuck in the yellow tier maps and having a smooth progression through the Atlas and getting to the high tier red maps on League launch. Okay, so that's it for this video, guys. I hope you liked and learned something from it, and see you guys in the next video. Bye.